This is a song that I just recorded, and it's an old song called Unchained Melody. I had to play the piano, so it'll take just a second.
The last photo of Elvis, the Presley estate tried to bury. There is a photograph of Elvis Presley that was taken 11 hours before he died, and the people who saw it were offered money to forget it existed. Not asked politely, not requested through lawyers with carefully worded letters. Offered money, cash. The kind that comes in unmarked envelopes handed across tables in quiet rooms where the air conditioning hums just loud enough to cover the sound of a conversation no one is supposed to remember having. This isn't speculation. This is what happened in the weeks immediately following August 16th, 1977, when the world was still reeling from the announcement that Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll, had been found dead on the bathroom floor of his Graceland mansion. While the planet mourned, while radio stations played his music on loop and grown men wept openly in the streets of Memphis, a very different kind of operation was underway behind the gates of that same mansion. It wasn't about grief. It wasn't about preserving his legacy. It was about finding a photograph and making absolutely certain that photograph never saw the light of day. The image was taken by someone who had access to the inner sanctum of Graceland, someone who was there not as a guest or a fan, but as part of the machinery that kept Elvis's world running. The exact identity of the photographer has never been publicly confirmed, but what we know from multiple corroborating sources is this. The photo was taken on August 15th, 1977, sometime in the late evening. It was not a posed shot. It was not intended for publication. It was, by all accounts, a private moment captured by someone who either didn't understand the significance of what they were documenting or understood it all too well. Within 72 hours of Elvis's death, that photographer was contacted, not by a family member expressing concern over privacy, not by a publicist asking for discretion out of respect for the grieving process. They were contacted by representatives of the Presley estate with a very specific agenda. The message was clear. The photograph needed to be handed over, and in exchange, certain financial considerations would be made. No scandal, no accusations, just a transaction. A quiet exchange that would allow everyone involved to move forward without complications. But here's the thing about photographs. They don't exist in singular form. There are negatives, there are prints. Then there are copies made before anyone even realizes the image might be valuable or dangerous. And in the chaos of those first few days after Elvis died, when Graceland was swarming with police and medical personnel and journalists camped outside the gates, that photograph had already begun to circulate in ways the estate couldn't fully control. A member of the household staff saw it. A nurse who had been attending to Elvis in his final weeks saw it. At least 2 individuals connected to the Memphis media saw it, though neither ever published it or spoke about it on the record. And every single one of those people, according to testimony that has surfaced over the years through legal depositions and private interviews, described the same reaction. They described feeling unsettled. And they described an image that didn't match the story they were being told about how Elvis Presley spent his final hours. They described something that felt, in their words, wrong. The estate didn't just ask for the photo back. They launched what can only be described as a systematic recovery operation. Private investigators were hired. Former employees were tracked down and interviewed. In at least one documented case, a legal settlement was reached with an individual who had been employed at Graceland during Elvis's final year, a settlement that included both a financial payout and a binding non-disclosure agreement that remains in effect to this day. This wasn't about protecting Elvis's dignity. If that had been the goal, there were 1,000 other images from his final years that showed him struggling, exhausted, vulnerable, images that did eventually make their way into tabloids and unauthorized biographies. Those pictures the estate tolerated. Some they even quietly allowed to circulate because they fit a narrative that was commercially useful. The tragic decline of a genius, the price of fame, the inevitable fall of an icon who burned too bright. But this photograph, this one specific image taken 11 hours before his death, was treated differently. It was treated like evidence. And evidence of what exactly? That's the question that has lingered for nearly 50 years, buried under layers of legal maneuvering and institutional silence. Because here's what we know and what we can prove. The official timeline of Elvis's death, the one that was presented to the public and accepted by the press, He places him alone in his bathroom in the early afternoon of August 16th. The story goes that he was reading, that he suffered a sudden cardiac event, that by the time he was discovered, it was already too late. A tragic, solitary end for a man who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by crowds. But if that photograph shows what multiple witnesses have quietly suggested it shows, if it captures Elvis in a state and a location and a context that contradicts that carefully constructed timeline, then everything the world was told about how the king of rock and roll died starts to fall apart. And the people who built their fortunes on managing his legacy, on controlling his image, on deciding which truths about Elvis Presley the public gets to access, those people had every reason in the world to make sure that photograph disappeared. Once it almost did. For decades, it seemed like it had. But photographs, like secrets, have a way of surviving longer than the people who tried to bury them. The photograph didn't just capture Elvis Presley in his final hours. It captured him in a condition that directly contradicted the version of events the estate had spent millions refining and protecting. This wasn't an image of a man resting peacefully before a sudden medical emergency. This was an image of someone who looked like he was already gone. The people who saw it before it was buried described a scene that has never appeared in any official account of Elvis's death. He wasn't alone. He wasn't in the bathroom. And he wasn't in the kind of physical state you would expect from someone who supposedly had another 11 hours to live. One former staff member, and speaking years later under the protection of anonymity, said that when she saw the photo, her first thought wasn't sadness. It was confusion. Because the man in that image didn't look like someone who was about to read a book and suffer an unexpected heart attack. He looked like someone who had already been through something catastrophic. But what made the photograph truly dangerous wasn't just Elvis's condition. It was the other people in the frame. Because Elvis wasn't alone when that picture was taken. And the individuals surrounding him in that moment were not the people you would expect to find at the bedside of a dying man. They weren't family. They weren't close friends offering comfort in a moment of crisis. They were members of his inner circle, yes, but they were the members whose proximity to Elvis in his final months had already raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered. One of those individuals was someone who had pharmaceutical access. Not a licensed physician in the traditional sense, but someone who operated within that gray space where loyalty to Elvis and control over his medical care overlapped in ways that made accountability nearly impossible. This person's presence in the photograph, in that room, at that specific time, creates a timeline problem that the estate has never addressed. Because according to the official record, this individual wasn't even at Graceland during the hours leading up to Elvis's death. They were documented as being elsewhere. A detail that provided convenient distance when questions about responsibility started circulating in the months after the funeral. But the photograph tells a different story. And if that photograph is accurate, if it genuinely captures the scene it appears to capture, then someone lied about where they were and what they were doing while Elvis Presley was dying. Not a small lie told to avoid embarrassment, a lie told to avoid culpability. There was another figure in the image, someone whose identity has been even more aggressively protected than the others. Multiple sources have referred to this person only as the associate, a term so deliberately vague it borders on parody. But the vagueness is intentional, because this associate, whoever they were, had a relationship with Elvis that went beyond professional obligation. Yet they had access to his private spaces. They had influence over his schedule. And in the final 6 months of his life, they were present during moments when even longtime members of Elvis's Memphis Mafia, the tight-knit group of friends and handlers who had surrounded him for years, were conspicuously absent. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. When the photograph surfaced internally, when it was being passed quietly between the handful of people who had seen it before the estate's recovery operation kicked in. And this associate's presence became the detail that people fixated on. Not because their face was unfamiliar, but because it shouldn't have been there at all. Several members of Elvis's staff later gave statements, some formal and some off the record, expressing confusion and even alarm about how much time this person was spending with Elvis in his final weeks. One security officer described being told to allow this individual access to Elvis's private quarters at unusual hours, instructions that came from someone high enough in the hierarchy that questioning them wasn't an option. The photograph froze that access in time. It documented who was in the room when Elvis was at his most vulnerable, and it did so with a clarity that no amount of after-the-fact testimony or managed narrative could explain away. Now, you can't argue with a photograph. You can suppress it, you can buy it, you can threaten the people who've seen it, but you can't argue with what it shows. And what it showed, according to those who've described it, was a man who was not in control of his own final hours. The setting itself raised questions. This wasn't the bathroom where Elvis was officially discovered. It wasn't his bedroom. It was a location within Graceland that has never been identified in any public accounting of his death. A room that doesn't appear in the carefully curated tours that millions of fans have walked through over the decades. The existence of that room and the fact that Elvis was photographed there in the state he was in suggests a level of planning and management around his final day that goes far beyond what the public has ever been told. One nurse, whose name appeared in a sealed deposition that was later partially leaked, described the photo as showing medical intervention, not emergency intervention, not the frantic efforts of people trying to save a life. Intervention that looked controlled, methodical, the kind of thing that happens when people know what's coming and are managing it rather than reacting to it. She never said those words directly. She didn't have to. The implication was clear enough that within a week of giving that deposition, she was no longer employed in any capacity connected to the Presley estate. Her testimony was sealed. Her name was redacted. And the photograph she described seeing, the one that showed Elvis surrounded by people who should not have been there, in a condition that did not align with sudden cardiac arrest, he disappeared into the same legal black hole that has swallowed every other inconvenient truth about August 16, 1977. But here's the thing the estate couldn't control. Memory doesn't sign non-disclosure agreements. And the people who saw that photograph, who carried the weight of what it revealed, didn't all stay silent forever. The operation to erase the photograph from existence didn't unfold like you'd expect. There were no public announcements, no press releases explaining that the estate was protecting the family's privacy. This was quieter than that, quieter and far more deliberate. Within a week of Elvis's funeral, people who had been inside Graceland during his final days started receiving visits, not from grief counselors or friends checking in from men in suits who introduced themselves with business cards that listed law firms in Nashville and Los Angeles, firms that represented interests connected to the Presley estate. The conversations followed a script. They'd start with condolences, a brief acknowledgement of the tragedy, the kind of preamble that made what came next feel almost reasonable. Then they'd pivot. They'd mention that certain materials, photographs specifically, had been taken during a very sensitive time. They'd explain that the family was concerned about privacy, about protecting Elvis's dignity in death the way he deserved. And then they'd make an offer, a financial offer. The amount varied depending on who was being approached and what leverage the estate believed they had, but the structure was always the same. Money in exchange for any photographs, and any negatives, any copies, and silence, always silence. Most people took the deal, not because they were hiding something, but because saying no to that kind of pressure when you're a housekeeper or a staff nurse or a low-level security guard isn't really an option. You take the money, you sign the paper, you move on. And for years, that system worked flawlessly. The estate recovered images from at least a dozen individuals, and every single one of those transactions was handled outside of public record. No court filings, no receipts that could be subpoenaed, just cash and signatures and the quiet, efficient erasure of evidence. But they missed one, and the person who kept it didn't do so out of defiance or greed. They kept it because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't have it. This individual, whose identity has still not been made fully public, even now, understood something that others didn't. They understood that the photograph wasn't just a piece of memorabilia or a privacy concern. It was documentation. It was proof of something that powerful people needed to remain hidden. And in their mind, handing over the only copy they had meant losing the only insurance they'd ever have if someone decided their silence needed to be more permanent than a non-disclosure agreement could guarantee. So they kept it, they hid it, and for 40 years, they told no one it existed. Not their spouse, not their closest friends, no one. They moved out of Memphis. They changed careers. They built a life as far away from Graceland and the Presley legacy as they could possibly get. And the photograph stayed buried in a safety deposit box in a city no one would ever think to look. Wrapped in plastic, sealed in an envelope that hadn't been opened since the day it was placed there in late August of 1977. What finally changed wasn't a sudden attack of conscience or a desire for fame. It was age, mortality, the creeping realization that if they died without ever bringing the photograph forward, the truth it represented would die with them. And after decades of watching the Presley estate grow into a billion-dollar enterprise built on a foundation of carefully managed stories and selective memory, they decided that Elvis deserved better. Not the brand, not the legend, the man. In 2019, this individual reached out to a journalist, not a tabloid reporter, not someone looking for a sensational headline, and a legitimate investigative journalist with a track record of handling sensitive material responsibly. The meeting was arranged carefully. No phones, no recordings. Just two people sitting across from each other in a neutral location while one of them explained what they had and why they'd kept it hidden for so long. When the photograph was finally placed on the table, when the journalist saw it for the first time, the reaction was immediate. This wasn't some grainy, unclear image that could be dismissed or debated. This was sharp, this was clear, and this was undeniably Elvis Presley, undeniably in distress, undeniably surrounded by people whose presence in that room at that time contradicted fundamental pieces of the official story. The journalists wanted to publish it immediately. They understood the significance. And they understood that this single image could rewrite the narrative of one of the most famous deaths in American history. But the individual who'd brought it forward had one condition. They needed legal protection first. They needed guarantees that going public wouldn't result in the kind of retaliation that had quietly destroyed other people who'd crossed the estate. So they waited. Lawyers were consulted, strategies were discussed. And while those conversations were happening, something else occurred that no one had anticipated. The Presley estate found out, not because of a leak, not because someone talked. They found out because they'd never stopped looking. For 4 decades, they'd maintained a quiet, ongoing effort to track down any remaining trace of that photograph. And somewhere in the process of securing legal representation, a name got flagged, a connection got made. And within 2 weeks, the individual who'd kept the photograph hidden for 40 years received a letter. It wasn't a threat. Legally, it couldn't be, but it didn't need to be. The letter reminded them of the non-disclosure agreement they'd signed in 1977. It reminded them of the financial settlement they'd accepted. And it reminded them, in language carefully crafted by attorneys who specialized in exactly this kind of pressure, that violating that agreement would result in consequences that would extend far beyond a lawsuit. It would mean the full weight of one of the most powerful estates in entertainment history coming down on them with everything it had. The photograph still exists, but it has never been published. And the person who kept it safe for all those years made a choice that maybe you'd make too if you were in their position. They stepped back. They returned to silence. And the one piece of evidence that could have shattered the myth remained locked away, protected not by truth, but by fear. The official story of Elvis Presley's death is built on a timeline that has been repeated so many times it's taken on the weight of fact. August 16th, 1977, early afternoon. Elvis retires to his bathroom with a book. He suffers a sudden cardiac event. His girlfriend finds him unresponsive on the floor. Paramedics are called. Efforts to revive him fail. He's pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital at 3:30 in the afternoon. Cause of death, cardiac arrhythmia. A heart that simply gave out under the strain of years of excess and exhaustion. And that story held for decades because it was simple, tragic, and most importantly, it required no one to be responsible. There were no villains in that version, just a man whose body betrayed him. But the photograph taken 11 hours before that official timeline says Elvis died tells a completely different story. And the contradictions aren't subtle. If Elvis was photographed in the late evening of August 15th in the condition that witnesses have described, in a location that wasn't his bathroom, surrounded by individuals who later claimed they hadn't seen him during those final hours, then the timeline doesn't just have gaps, it collapses entirely. Because the physical state captured in that image, the state that made a nurse feel sick and a security officer use the word wrong, that's not the state of someone who has 11 hours left to live and is going to spend them reading alone. That's the state of someone who's already in crisis, someone who's already past the point where intervention could have made a difference. The presence of specific individuals in that photograph creates another problem the estate has never addressed. These weren't people who happened to be passing through. These were people with access, with influence, with direct control over what medications Elvis was taking and when. And if they were in that room in those final hours, managing what was happening to him rather than reacting to it, then every statement they gave afterward about not knowing how serious his condition was, about being shocked by his sudden death, becomes something other than grief. It becomes a coordinated story. And coordinated stories exist for one reason: to protect the people telling them. The location itself is perhaps the most damning detail. The room where the photograph was taken has never been identified in any public record of Elvis's death. It doesn't appear in police reports. It doesn't appear in the statements given by paramedics or hospital staff. And it wasn't the bathroom where he was officially discovered. So if Elvis was in that room, in that condition, hours before he supposedly died alone, then someone moved him. Someone staged the scene. Someone made a deliberate choice about how and where Elvis Presley's body would be found. And they made that choice knowing it would shape the narrative of his death for generations. The toxicology evidence that later surfaced, the evidence that showed levels of pharmaceuticals in his system that independent medical reviewers called inconsistent with the official cause of death, aligns perfectly with what that photograph suggests. This wasn't a man who died from a sudden heart attack. This was a man whose system had been so compromised by the substances he'd been given, substances prescribed and administered by people he trusted, that his body had no capacity left to survive. And the estate knew it. They knew it when they sent those men in suits to buy back every copy of that photograph. They knew it when they sealed the autopsy for 50 years. They knew it when they paid off witnesses and buried depositions and built an entire commercial empire on a version of Elvis's death that protected everyone except the man who actually died. Yet the photograph didn't just capture Elvis's final hours. It captured the truth that the people who profited most from his death have spent half a century making sure you'd never see. This story doesn't end unless you refuse to let it disappear. Share this video with someone who deserves to know the truth. Subscribe if you're done accepting the version of history that powerful estates paid millions to create. Elvis deserved better than a managed lie, and so do you.